Chapter 12 deals with coming into contact with other cultures and what can happen in that process, how you learn to successfully integrate, join the dance, or what can go wrong. So we're going to start by talking about, in general, how people come in contact with other cultures. This can happen even if you don't leave your own country, but happens most frequently when people go abroad, and it can happen for a range of reasons, some good, some not so good, and some of the things that bring folks together from different cultures that have done so over the years, been things like evangelizing uh, populations, people leaving for a better way of life for themselves and their families, or things like invading other countries. And what happens in those different situations really creates different dynamics. So in terms of going abroad, if you're going abroad voluntarily or with a group, with a family, whether you have to leave your country, those are all things that can change the dynamics of how that interaction works quite a bit. We're going to be talking also in this chapter about basically what it takes to communicate successfully across cultures, and it kind of summarizes some of the things that we've been talking about throughout the course, namely the importance of knowing about the other culture, knowing language, nonverbal codes, things like that, how motivated you are to communicate with people from that other culture, and the skills that you have that you bring to that conversation. Language is part of that. Language by itself is not enough, but on the other hand, language is really the only way to get fully inside of a culture and understand it from the inside and not be looking at it from the outside. We're going to be talking about this process of acculturation, which refers to the process of adapting to a new culture. And this applies to people who are going to another country for a longer period of time, not to tourists. And when this happens, it can create a good deal of stress for obvious reasons, and the degree of stress really varies significantly depending on a variety of factors, how similar that new culture is to what you're used to, how old you are, whether you're male or female, lots of different factors. One of the things that I think is quite clear is that young people, particularly children who haven't really been acculturated into their own cultures, have a much easier time. I remember when my son started going to kindergarten in Germany when we were living there when I was teaching at a German university, that we were very nervous about his first day at kindergarten because he didn't speak any German. So when he got home after lunch, we said, "How did it go?" He said, "Fine, no problems." It wasn't a big deal to him at all that people were talking to him in a language that he didn't understand at all. He was able to figure things out. This is typical of what happens to people at a young age in other cultures. Another factor is the environment, how receptive, obviously, the host culture is. That can vary a great deal, and of course, it depends on the individual himself or herself as well. Usually, one points to different kinds of acculturation different degrees of how integrated a person becomes in that target culture. Assimilation is one possibility, and this is kind of the melting pot idea, namely that that you take on completely the norms and values, language of the new culture, and discard your native culture.
We are the Borg. Lower your shields and surrender your ships. We will add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own. Your culture will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile.
On the other hand, there's integration, where you are able to keep your original cultural identity, but you also develop a understanding and acceptance of the new culture. Separation is when there's voluntary segregation of a group. You have that, for example, in the variety of Chinatowns that exist in major cities in the United States, in New York and Boston, San Francisco, where you have people living in communities that are totally Chinese. Amish would be another example of that. And then you have separation, segregation that's not voluntary. What happened with Native Americans, for example, being put on reservations. And then you have what's called cultural transmutation by our author. This is the idea of identifying not with the dominant culture, but with a microculture. So, for example, coming into the United States and identifying with a gang would be one example of that. In terms of cultural transmutation, we're going to watch a short clip that shows a young white professional and his relationship to hip-hop culture. So let's take a look at that.
I've got my pistol point cocked, ready to link shots non-stop until I see your monkey ass drop. And let your homies know who done it. Cause when it comes to this gangster shit, you motherfuckers know who run it. We standing up for our own shit. And if you with this motherfucker to the test, you gotta realize something, nigga. You fucking with the very bitch. I got this killer up inside of me. I can't talk to my mother, so I talk to my diary.
This clip was from the beginning of the movie Office Space. And at the time when this movie was made, which was a while back, I think whites enjoying rap music was seen as kind of unusual, maybe bizarre. Certainly not the case anymore today, and hip-hop is a worldwide phenomenon in youth culture. And it's one of the things that can help in acculturation for young people. Anything that you have in common with people from the new culture can help a great deal. So if you have in common, for example, the situation that you both are in, studying at a university, for example, that can be very helpful in the process of getting acclimatized to that new culture. There are other factors that can play a role as well. For example, the history of the relationship of the two cultures involved. So if one of those is a former colony, that can bring with it a certain dynamic. Another thing that can affect the relationship is if there's a special historical relationship, like the Hmong in the United States, to whom we owe a great debt because they were allies in the Vietnam War. The relationship between the Germans and Israelis is fraught with history in terms of the Holocaust, and so that can affect what happens when people from those two cultures encounter one another. Another factor can be whether a country is a historically immigrant country, like the United States, which until recently was welcoming to immigrants, or whether it's a country that has not had a history of immigration. That's the case with Japan, for example. In terms of getting acculturated, it really can vary quite a bit. Just imagine you moving to Canada and what that would be like. Same language, unless you move to Quebec. A very similar culture in terms of its norms, its values, religious beliefs, even things like media, TV shows, movies, a lot of things that you'd have in common. Compare that to moving to North Korea and the difficulties that you would probably have in adjusting to life in North Korea. You would probably not find too many people who speak English, be a very different political system, different religious beliefs, certainly the way of life, everyday routines, food, shopping, so many things would be utterly different. And what you would probably encounter in that case would be what's called culture shock, where you feel that you're out of place, that things are just so different that it's very hard for you to adjust. And this is something that's pretty universal and experienced not only if you go to North Korea, but even if you go to a Western European country, that you'll find that that's the case. What happens really is that your routine is disrupted, and human beings are creatures of following routines. And what happens when you go to a different country, even if you went to England, for example, is that the details of everyday life would be very different. Going shopping is a different experience. Going to restaurants, a lot of things are going to be different. Even if you know the language well, you can have problems. Think about, for example, someone coming to the United States who's learned English very well, goes shopping in a grocery store, and the clerk says, paper or plastic. Well, the person probably learned both of those words, but the context may not be clear what's meant by that question. Culture shock is something that's not experienced if you're not really exposed fully to the culture. For example, if you go on a group with a group tourist with a group of tourists, you're probably not going to experience culture shock, because it's going to be staying in high-priced tourist hotels and have not be exposed to the language, or in other situations you might be insulated from the culture as well. How long culture shock takes depends on the individual. Typically, there are stages that one goes through in terms of culture shock, and the first stage is actually very positive. This is called the honeymoon stage, where everything is new and exciting, and you're really looking forward to your experience, and then you enter into a period of frustration. Things, your language skills maybe don't work the way you thought they should. What you learned in class isn't what you need in terms of language. You might be depressed. You might have physical symptoms, headaches, stomach ache, difficulty sleeping, lots of things that make you feel uncomfortable. And after a certain period of time, you get to know other people there. Hopefully you make friends. Your language ability improves. You've been bombarded by the language. You hear it all the time. It's inevitable that your language ability improves. And so eventually you come to feel much more comfortable in the culture. You feel like you're acclimated. that you're able to function. You're able to go into stores, make yourself understood. When you go to a restaurant, you know what you like. You can read the menu. You're able to ask questions and get responses. People don't look at you strange when you ask a question. Things like that. So that's basically the what typically happens in terms of the different stages of culture shock, but it's not necessarily what happens to everybody. It's kind of an individual thing, but typically there's kind of U pattern where you you start at the high level and then you bottom out and then you go back up. But what can happen very often is that it's not a single U pattern, that rather it's kind of a repeated cycles where things get better and better, where you have this cycle of stress, adaptation, and growth, and then eventually things get better and better. But one of the let's talk about some of the factors that can be the cause of culture shock or can make the situation worse. One is if you're a very rigid kind of person and unused to change and don't like change and have a difficult time seeing other points of view, you're probably going to have a hard time with acculturation, and culture shock's going to hit hard. If you're not open to making friends, if you have difficulty making friends, that's going to be another factor, obviously. The extent to which you're able to be by yourself and not be too bothered by that. Some people are perfectly okay being by themselves, they can amuse themselves. Other folks have to have people around all the time, so that's another factor. Homesickness can obviously be an issue. That kind of depends on your relationships. Holidays can be very stressful, that you don't have your family around as you normally would in holidays. There are different customs for Christmas, for example. Then there are things that can help alleviate culture shock, and let's talk about some of those. One is to find something that you can put a lot of effort into, spend a lot of time on, work intensely on, and kind of forget about some of the problems that you're having. For example, working on the language of the culture where you happen to be would be such a project. Language by itself, knowing the language by itself is not enough. If you learn the grammar, learn the vocabulary, that's very important. To learn language speaking proficiency, that's important, but it's not enough. I'll give you an example of that. We had a number of years ago, we had a full-time Spanish instructor who surprisingly had never been abroad. It's kind of unusual, I would say, in a language teacher, but that was the case for her. She'd never been abroad. She volunteered to take a group of VCU students to Spain for a summer program. She lasted less than a week and had such bad culture shock, despite the fact that she spoke fluent Spanish. Things were so different there in Spain, and not obviously what she expected. She came home after a week. We had to send somebody else over there. So language by itself isn't enough to get over culture shock. It's important to try to blend in, to not stand out. Sometimes you can't help that if you're, for example, American. If you're a white American studying, for example, in China, you're going to stand out. But to the extent possible, you want to try to blend in. Another thing that can be very helpful is if there are other expatriates there, other Americans, for example, that can really help a lot. When I was teaching in Austria, at a high school in Austria, I happened to meet an American couple there. The wife was also teaching, and the husband was going to medical school in Austria. And it was really great to be able to get together with them occasionally. I didn't do it very often, but for example, for American holidays. And I had the experience also of being in Salzburg on July the 4th, and knew an American woman there, and there was there was a American celebration among the expat community there in Salzburg for July 4th. Those are great things if you can tap into those. Really help in terms of adjusting to the culture that you're living in. One of the things that can be very good also is to write a blog about your experiences, so your not only your family and friends, other folks can read about it. That's really can be helpful, and technology in general can really help these days. The availability of Skype, for example. Culture shock is not only something negative, it can have positive aspects. The fact that you're experiencing culture shock indicates that you're fully engaged with the new culture, which is better than staying on the outside and being isolated. Provides an opportunity to learn about yourself. This is kind of a sink or swim situation. And one of the things, if you can successfully navigate dealing with culture shock, living in a different culture, that makes you more adaptable to new situations. That's a really good and positive thing. And being able to operate comfortably in a different culture really creates a new version of you. Gives you really a whole different perspective on reality. Culture shock can be experienced by individuals, but it can also be experienced by the host culture in reaction to people from the outside coming in. One of the things that can cause misunderstandings is kind of assumed similarity. For example, if you see McDonald's, you say, oh, well, it must be the same as back home, or KFC. If you go to KFC, for example, in China, wow, how different is that? A whole different menu than what you see here. A couple of examples, kind of interesting. There was this famous example in the 90s of a woman in New York City from Denmark, a tourist, who went to a restaurant with her husband, left her baby outside of the restaurant in a stroller. This was something that was very common in Copenhagen, where she was from. She got arrested for child neglect, and her baby was put into foster care. This was not behavior that was acceptable in the United States. In fact, there was something similar with a Swedish woman in 2011 who was also got into trouble. In Scandinavian culture, there's not a sense that there's any danger there, even in an urban environment. So very different. You can't assume that norms and practices and behavior are the same, even though it's an urban environment. I think, well, it's the same thing as back home. Here's another example of that I know of, that people have run into, Americans who go to China who are children of Chinese immigrants. So there's maybe second or third generation Chinese, and they look Chinese. And so when they go to China, what happens? Well, the Chinese expect them to speak perfect Mandarin because they look Chinese, and they're very shocked, a kind of reverse culture shock when they see that those Americans don't speak Mandarin. What happens with people who come back from living in abroad? Students who go for a year, for example, to study in France or Spain. Well, you get what's called reverse culture shock, and this is kind of the W curve of culture shock. We talked about the U curve. Well, the W curve is you come back home, you think everything is great, and then you get depressed. Well, why do you get depressed? Well, things back home are just the same. You have changed. You're a new person, but everybody treats you the same. And this can be something that can be quite disorienting, quite distressing to people who come back. Well, the final thing we're going to talk about very briefly is what we talked about at the beginning. What does it take to be competent in communicating with people from different cultures? Well, these are things that we've talked about for the entire course. You have to have the knowledge of the other culture, and lots of things involved there. You have to not be ethnocentric. That's obviously very important. You have to know yourself. That's part of the knowledge component. Know about your own values. Knowing about your own heritage can be very helpful as well. Obviously, you have to be motivated to interact successfully with other cultures. If you're very anxious and very uncertain about whether this is something you really want to do or not, things are probably not going to go that smoothly. What's called in the by the our author in the textbook psychomotor component is really the skills that you have. The ability, for example, if you learned a language in a classroom, that's probably going to be a different situation when you actually go abroad and use it. You'll find that the pragmatics of using the language in everyday life are quite different and something that you haven't learned in the classroom. And finally, there's the context of being able to deal with different situations that you encounter. One of those would be you're invited to somebody's house for dinner, for example, and do you walk around and explore all the rooms? Do you ask to, do you wander into the kitchen? Well, if it's a house in France, as we know, well, that's something that's you're not supposed to do as a guest. You're not supposed to just wander around their private spheres, and knowing about those kinds of things is kind of important. Knowing how to act in different situations and in different contexts is really important. And that's our final presentation for Chapter 12.